Well, hello there, slashaholics. This is Lisa Wilcox here from A Nightmare on Elm Street 4 and 5, Alice Johnson, and you are listening to the 80s Slasher Librarian. Ciao. Have fun.
A Nightmare on Elm Street, Part 5, The Dream Child, the novelization of the film by Joseph Locke. Chapter 8. When Yvonne's shift ended early the next morning, she went straight to the university locker room and changed from her uniform into a bikini. It had been a rough night, and she was looking forward to a long rest in the steam room, then a few laps around the pool. In the steam room, she sat with her back to the wall, hugging one leg to her breasts. She needed some time alone, away from work and even her friends. She'd been so busy lately, she'd had no time to just relax and think a while. About Dan, about Greta. The hot steam massaged her stiff muscles, loosened them, relieved their aches, wrapped her in a blanket of clinging warmth. She leaned her head back, closed her eyes, and sat up with a gasp, drenched with perspiration. "Damn!" she hissed, chiding herself for falling asleep. She couldn't afford to spend the whole morning in the steam room. Yvonne stood and left the room, went to the pool and climbed up the diving board. Still feeling groggy, she stopped to rub her eyes before walking out onto the board, and the diving board lurched suddenly, nearly knocking her over the side to the concrete 30 feet below. She clutched the railing and screamed as the board began to shake violently, and the metal girders that supported it groaned loudly, as if under a tremendous strain. Yvonne leaned against the railing, hugging it desperately, and looked over the side as the girders beneath her began to wilt slowly, as if they were melting. They swayed this way, that way, then began to move faster, whipping the board back and forth. She clutched the railing even harder, until it snapped off in her arms like a frail piece of plastic. And Yvonne pressed herself flat against the board, face down, hugging it for life, when the board itself began to break up, cracking loudly and separating into 4 long, narrow sections which spread apart slowly, farther and farther apart, like 4 enormous fingers. "No!" Yvonne screamed so loudly that her throat hurt. This can't be happening!" Giant curved knives sprang from the ends of the 4 sections as they curled slowly around her. Yvonne looked over her shoulder as one of the girders shot upward from the back of the board and bent as if jointed like a thumb. "No, please God, no!" she screamed, closing her eyes as the hand closed slowly. "Somebody help me, please, somebody!" The platform gave a tremendous jerk, and Yvonne suddenly sensed movement. Upward movement. She opened her eyes to see that the diving board, or what had once been a diving board, was shooting up at an incredible speed. The pole was growing smaller and more distant beneath her, and when she looked up, the ceiling was growing rapidly closer. And Yvonne, realizing she was about to be crushed like a fly against the ceiling, scrambled desperately toward the edge of the giant hand that held her, throwing herself off and falling down toward the pool, falling faster and faster, and she screamed when she saw that the pool was empty. She was plummeting toward the light blue concrete floor of the pool faster and faster, and as she fell, screaming, she saw something very strange. In the middle of the pool floor, the concrete surface was shifting, forming rounded ridges that somehow resembled lips. The lips separated into an oval-shaped opening that led to an endless tunnel with glistening pink walls that seemed to pulse. Yvonne fell farther and farther, as if she would never land, and as she stared down at what she was certain would be her death, the opening in the pool exploded with the thick, black-red liquid that gushed upward like a geyser, spraying into the air and covering the light blue floor, rising quickly until it was sloshing against the pool walls, nearly filling it. Blood. The pool was filling with blood. The black-red surface flew up at Yvonne with lightning speed, and she fell into the pool of blood with a thick splash. She began kicking and flailing her arms, trying to keep her head above the surface so she could breathe. Her hair pressed slickly to her face as she struggled, but her efforts were doing very little, if any good, because below her she felt a powerful swirl in the pool, and realized that all around her, the level of blood against the pool walls was lowering. The strange opening in the bottom of the pool had stopped gushing blood. It was now sucking the blood back out again. Yvonne felt herself being pulled toward the center of the pool and sucked under the viscous, lumpy surface of blood. She fought harder, sweeping her arms at her sides, frantically trying to steer herself to the pool's edge. In spite of the tremendous pull beneath her, she managed to inch her way to the side of the pool, closer, a little closer, until she was close enough to reach out and slap her hands onto the concrete. She clutched the lift that surrounded the pool and began pulling with all of her strength to lift herself out of the mire, when 2 feet appeared before her. Above the viscous slurping sounds that came from the pool, Yvonne heard a sinister laugh as Freddy hunkered down in front of her. Propped an elbow on his knee and clanged his blades together as he said, "Careful! There's an underflow!" "No!" she cried. "Please help me! Please help me!" He reached out his right arm and delicately scraped his blades over the back of her left hand, laughing. The stinging pain made her scream, and when she saw the blood, her own blood, Yvonne lost her grip and sat up screaming in the steam room with a little cry, froze and looked around her. When she realized that she'd fallen asleep and dreamed it all, she relaxed with a loud sigh and scrubbed her face with her moist palms. But her relief was short-lived. A chill crept over her in spite of the steam room's heat, and she whispered, "Oh my God!" It's true, she thought. Everything Alice said is true. Chapter 9. "He was just like you said," Yvonne whispered over the counter to Alice that afternoon in the Crave Inn. "He was horribly burned, and he had those awful knives on his hand, and—" She extended her left arm, pulled back the bandage on her hand, and showed Alice the cuts. "He did this!" Alice stared at the cuts with a sinking feeling in her stomach and said, "I'm glad that's all he did. You're lucky to be alive. I just don't understand how he's getting in when I'm awake. He'd trick you into pulling friends into your dreams while you slept. Then he'd kill them, right?" "Right. But now he's getting to them while I'm awake. First Stan, then Greta, he almost got Mark, and then you. Next, he's liable to come after me while I'm awake. Me and my baby." She breathed. A frightening thought hit her hard, and she covered her mouth with a palm. "Oh my God, Yvonne. Do unborn babies dream?" Yvonne's eyes widened with stunned realization. "Yeah, they do. About 3/4 of their lives in the womb." Alice swept a hand through her hair, chewing her lip, and asked, "Can you reach Dr. Morris?" "Well, it's Sunday. I can try him at home." Taking off her apron, Alice said, "If Freddy's gotten into the baby's dreams, he could be doing something to my baby." Yvonne smiled slightly. "Your baby? The baby you don't feel anything for?" Alice smiled, too, realizing that she did indeed feel something for the baby. She felt a great deal. "I just want to know right away, all right? If that's what Freddy's doing, maybe we can stop him." "From the tone of your voice, Yvonne," Dr. Morris said, seated on the corner of his desktop and frowning with irritation, "I expected some kind of emergency, but I don't see anything about Alice that would make ultrasound necessary this early in the pregnancy. And it certainly isn't necessary on Sunday afternoon." Alice said, "I want to make sure my baby's all right." Dr. Morris sighed and rolled his eyes. "Listen, Alice, I can assure you that—" "Do unborn babies dream, Dr. Morris?" she asked, interrupting him. In a flat, annoyed voice, the doctor replied, "Approximately 78% of their day. There's even been some research supporting the concept of a dream link between the child and mother. A sort of psychic, umbilical cord." "I don't understand." "Well, there may be times when a mother is actually able to experience her unborn baby's dreams." He frowned again, looking back and forth between Yvonne and Alice. "Is that why you interrupted my tennis game? Because you're afraid your baby's having nightmares?" "We're here to find out everything we can, Doctor." Then Yvonne said, "And the thing of it is, we're kind of in a hurry, so maybe you could give Alice the test first and yell at us later?" He stood. "Well, now that my afternoon's ruined anyway, I might as well." Mark was exhausted. He'd been guzzling coffee all day, and as a result he had a headache, and his hands were trembling. He hadn't slept last night, hadn't allowed himself to sleep, now that he knew his dreams were dangerous. To keep himself occupied, he'd been working furiously, drawing a single picture over and over again, each time from a different angle. The house he'd seen in his dream with the rusty spiked welcome mat before the door. He began to nod sleepily over his work and sat up with a jerk, yawning, then sipping his coffee. As he set his cup down again, he noticed a comic book on his table that he hadn't seen before. He picked it up and read the title, written in red, dripping letters on the cover, Krueger's Nightmares from Hell. Curious, he opened it at random and gasped when he saw a drawing of Greta in an enormous high chair, her white bloated face covered with dribbling lumps of food. Horrified, Mark flipped through the comic book and saw a drawing of Dan in the clutches of a motorcycle with hideous human features, and Yvonne diving into an empty swimming pool with an enormous vaginal-like opening in the bottom, and himself The drawing depicted Mark at his drawing table, reading a comic book. It was followed by several blank panels. He took in a breath and whispered,
"Oh my God."
A terribly scarred hand tore out of the comic book's pages and slapped onto Mark's face, the fingers digging into his flesh, and as Mark screamed, the hand pulled with tremendous strength, ripping Mark from his chair and into the comic book. He was tossed through the air and back into his own room, except it wasn't really his room. It was a two-dimensional illustration of his room, drawn in the exaggerated perspective of a comic book. He hit the floor hard and landed against his drawing table, which ripped like paper. It was paper, a drawing rather than an actual tangible piece of furniture. He heard an ominous ripping sound and, sprawled on the floor, looked up to see that 4 blades were cutting through the paper wall. Evil eyes peered through the cuts, and Mark heard a laugh. Scrambling to his feet, Mark ran to the door, but he couldn't turn the knob because there was nothing to turn, nothing to grab hold of. It was just a drawing. Behind him, Freddy's knives continued to slice the paper. Then he stepped into the room and laughed uproariously. Lying on her back, Alice watched the ultrasound screen, enchanted as she listened to the sound of her baby's heartbeat. "We're still very early along in development," Dr. Morris muttered, mostly to himself. "Everything seems fine. Heartbeat's strong." The rhythmic sound was almost hypnotic, magical, and Alice found herself smiling as she looked at the screen, riveted until she heard another sound, a frightening sound that seemed to come from within her own head, the sound of ripping paper. With a start, she looked around her for the source of the sound, but saw nothing unusual. She returned her attention to the screen, and for the moment decided to ignore it. Mark ran to the nearest window, but it wouldn't open. "Faster than a head-on collision!" Freddy roared. As Mark clawed at the window, searching for a hold, he saw movement outside. A comic book version of a semi and Dan's red truck were headed straight for one another at high speed. When they collided, the word crash appeared in jagged bubble in the air above them.
No!
Mark cried, covering his eyes with his hands. Behind him, Freddy shouted, "Deader than your darling Greta!" When Mark lowered his hands, the window was gone, replaced by a vivid drawing of Greta in an old decayed high chair, her skin rotting, her eyes gone from their sockets, her mouth hanging open and filled with mush. Mark screamed and spun around as Freddy laughed. "Able to shred stupid little boys into bits and pieces!" He lifted his deadly claw high above Mark. "Everything's fine," Dr. Morris said half-heartedly, apparently preoccupied with the tennis game he was missing. He turned to Yvonne and said, "I'd like to have a word with you in my office." Without waiting for a response, he left the room. Yvonne turned to Alice, shrugged, and followed him out. Alice lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling, wondering if perhaps the ultrasound would not detect any damage Freddy might cause, when the ceiling disappeared as she heard Mark screaming,
"Alice!"
And she saw a frightening comic book illustration of him in his room, his eyes wide with horror as Freddy brought his claws down and sliced through the drawing of Mark. They cut him as if he were paper, He was paper, and the shreds fluttered to the floor in a pool of bright red ink. "No!" Alice shouted, sitting up and swinging her legs off the bed, as the wall before her began to pulsate, ribbed with veins, and the vertical lips appeared once again, opening to reveal the long pink tunnel that glistened with dribbling juices, and without warning, Alice was sucked off the bed and pulled headlong into the opening. She tumbled head over heels down the twisting tunnel, until she was swept into an enormous cavernous opening with viscous walls lined with pulsing veins. She lost some speed and moved slower as she tumbled between arteries and organs. She recognized them immediately. They looked like the illustrations from her biology textbooks, but she didn't understand them. Human organs hung over her like giant stars in a night sky. Alice floated slowly into a beam of glowing light and turned around to see a giant fetus, its knees curled up beneath its chin. Her eyes widened as she thought, "My baby, I'm inside myself." The fetus bobbed slightly, its umbilical cord curling from its belly, and turned toward her. Alice watched with wide-eyed fascination, smiling, until the belly of the fetus began to move, bulge, and the bulges took on human facial features. Alice gaped in horror as the features took on more definition, and she recognized Dan and Greta. Alice's scream echoed off the pink fleshy uterine walls around her as the faces yawned slightly, their eyes pleading for help, for release. She heard another scream meld with her own. It too echoed, growing closer and closer behind her. She turned to see a blob of light glowing, a soft electric blue, plummeting toward her. And she ducked, looking up to see Mark's face in the light, his mouth gaping as he shot toward the fetus, hitting its belly and disappearing in a burst of light. "No," Alice thought. "He got Mark! That bastard got Mark!" The uterine wall behind the fetus began to bulge and undulate. Facial features began to protrude from the glistening pink surface until Freddy was grinning at her, laughing. "Like father, like son." "No!" Alice screamed. "You're not my baby's father!" And Dr. Morris leaned over her, frowning, and said, "Of course I'm not." Alice blinked, sat up, and looked around at the ultrasound equipment, sputtering. My baby! What did he do to my baby?" "There's absolutely nothing wrong with your baby. Absolutely nothing," Dr. Morris said. "He's a perfectly healthy child. A little big for so early on, but as active and normal as any baby I've ever seen." Alice turned to Yvonne and hissed, "He's feeding the souls to the baby. I saw it, all of it. And he got Mark. I saw his soul." Yvonne stepped forward quickly and said, "I'm sorry, Dr. Morris. She's been having such a tough time since Dan died. I thought it might help. I'll take her home. I'm really sorry we dragged you down here." Alice sat up and clutched Yvonne's shoulders. "He's taking their souls. He's feeding them to my baby." Glancing at Dr. Morris apologetically, Yvonne said, "I'll take her home. It'll all look different after she gets some sleep." Alice stood, and Yvonne put an arm around her, leading her out. When they were gone, Dr. Morris went into his office, picked up the phone, and dialed the Jordans, waiting for an answer. "Hello? Mrs. Jordan, this is Dr. Morris. I'm terribly sorry to call on a Sunday, but, well, I think this is rather important. It's about Alice Johnson." Okay, Slashaholics, this has been the penultimate narration of The Dream Child, chapters 8 and 9. Only one more upload to go. I've really been actually enjoying this novelization. The Dream Child is like my least favorite Freddy movie, but there's enough extra and different things in the book that I think has really made it a better story. And if the movie had been able to do some of this stuff, like the extended diving board scene with Yvonne, all the extra stuff we got in that scene would have been amazing in the movie, right? Do you guys agree with that? I mean, come on, you're slashaholics. You gotta think like I am and agree that that dream sequence with all the diving board and everything morphing and stuff, that was a lot cooler than the movie where she just fell into a puddle, right? That's my thought anyways. Even the Mark scene was a bit different. We didn't get Super Freddy or whatever. I was kind of looking forward to that, but that's okay. It was kind of cool, like Freddy was ripping the page while Mark was running around in there. By the way, that's a wrap for Mark, the character of Mark tonight. Good job, Will Piccolo, one of our Slasher Icon patrons. That's a producer credit, $50 patron. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. At that tier, that's amazing. Thank you so much. But yeah, everybody, let me know what you thought of tonight's upload. If you're looking forward to the conclusion of the Dream Child novelization, what do you think of the little extra things we've gotten? And at the same time, are you upset at the things that didn't get included, like Super Freddy from the comic book? Just what are your thoughts on it so far? I'd love to hear from you guys. I know that these Nightmare on Elm Street novelizations are pretty short compared to most of the books on the channel. But I feel like part 3, 4, and 5 really gave us enough difference and extra stuff while still keeping the basic plot thread. Made it more entertaining that way. Parts 1 and 2 were pretty much on the nose, so just a couple differences in part 2. And part 3 was like almost a completely different story since it was based on the Wes Craven script. But I think part 5 is the closest to being more different than the movie, right below part 3's novelization. Because I've noticed, like on Dan's death, we got a lot more stuff there with like the truck being picked up by a claw and swung into the furnace and all that. We got enough differences there. Even Greta had a couple little tiny differences. And Yvonne's not her death, but her encounter with Freddy at the pool, I thought was a lot more tense, a lot more suspenseful. The imagery of the nightmare would have been amazing to see in one of the movies. To see it in the movie of The Dream Child. I think if these things had actually made it into the movie, maybe if they still kept the Super Freddy thing, but the way that Freddy entered the comic book nightmare by like ripping the page and peering in, if that could have been a part of it and him turning into Super Freddy, that would have been awesome. But yeah, the Yvonne scene at the pool I thought was great. I really didn't see that coming, and I really enjoyed those differences. But yeah, I'll be back very soon with the conclusion of A Nightmare on Elm Street, The Dream Child by Joseph Locke. Be sure to go to the community page right now, and you can vote on what the next book's going to be on the channel. The two choices are the Texas Chainsaw Massacre novelization. It's the novelization of the 2003 remake. Or Final Destination, Destination Zero. It's another one of the original Final Destination novels from Black Flame. And it has a plot line in it that goes back to Jack the Ripper, which I think is going to be an interesting thing. I've been told about it. I have not read it yet. But I am curious to see how the whole Jack the Ripper thing plays into the Final Destination universe. So that one's going to be cool. Either way, those will be the next two books I narrate. But you can go vote right now in the community tab in a poll to help pick what the next one will be. And it's either going to be the Texas Chainsaw Massacre followed by Destination Zero, or Destination Zero followed by the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The choice is up to you, so please go and vote. And until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80 slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, be excellent to each other, pleasant dreams, and we'll see you soon.